My name is David Bobb, and I serve as director of the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship at Hillsdale College. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to this lecture, part of the First Principles on First Fridays lecture series. This is a monthly series that addresses topics of significant and timely historical, political, and economic subjects. We are grateful today that this lecture series, which bears the name the Mrs. Walter R. Burger First Principles on First Fridays lecture, has been brought about as a result of her generosity. Mrs. Burger lives in Michigan, and she has a number of grandchildren that have served in the United States military, including Earl Pettis, a 2008 alumnus of Hillsdale College, who has recently returned from duty in Afghanistan. Today, we are honored to have as our speaker General Ronald Burgess, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. In a distinguished Army career of more than 40 years, General Burgess has established a record of exemplary service to his country for which we should all be grateful. General Burgess and his wife, Marta, who I'm pleased to say is here with us today, are the proud parents of 5 children, 2 of whom we at Hillsdale are proud to say are graduates of the college. The academic year has just started, and it's a bracing thought to realize that the college freshmen who just showed up at Hillsdale and around the country were just 8 years old when our nation was attacked on September 11th, 2001. Too young to understand its full meaning, and yet too old to be oblivious to it, those young people have been impacted by the terrorist acts of 9/11 indelibly, as we all have been. More than 1,300 children were orphaned on that day, a day in which nearly 3,000 lives were taken. Let us pause now for a moment of silence in remembrance of those victims. Thank you. Hillsdale College junior Caroline Forsyth, a politics major, is interning this semester with the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is as part of her participation in the semester-long Washington-Hillsdale internship program, which brings Hillsdale College undergraduates to Washington for study and work here in the nation's capital. It's a program that is nearly 40 years old. And I'm pleased to say that in keeping with Hillsdale's tradition that students introduce our speakers, I will now call upon Caroline to introduce General Burgess. Caroline.
Welcome. Lieutenant General Ronald L. Burgess Jr. is the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and Commander of the Joint Functional Component Command. In a career spanning nearly 40 years, he has received numerous awards and decorations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, the Army Achievement Medal, and the NATO Medal. Commissioned in military intelligence through the Auburn University ROTC program, he earned a Master of Science degree in Education from the University of Southern California and a Master of Military Arts and Science from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Today, General Burgess will be speaking on the timely and pressing topic, America's War on Terror. Please join me in welcoming General Burgess.
Thanks for the very good introduction. Well done. It is a great honor for me to be here today and spend time with you. I have some prepared remarks that I will move through, and then I have been told that we will do question and answer, and I will handle that here from the podium during that time. But as I prepared for my visit here today, as was pointed out by David, I couldn't help but remember Hillsdale's motto, pursuing truth and defending liberty. And that's a fitting place for me to begin my remarks because those words reflect the mission of the men and women of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Our intelligence work is aimed at preventing strategic surprise by uncovering the truth about current and potential adversaries' military intentions and capabilities. And we do this in defense of the nation. Just a few hours ago, I presided over DIA's ceremony in honor of the 7 agency employees that we lost in the Pentagon on 9/11. Now, I don't presume to speak for anyone else, but I, along with others, find it hard to believe that a decade has passed since that tragic day. We also cannot help but reflect on how the event affected the lives of so many of us in this room today, both directly and indirectly. As we think back to that day, it is important to remember that those killed in New York, at the Pentagon, and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, that of the 3,000 that David mentioned, that a little more than 10% of those folks, of those number killed on that day, were citizens of countries other than the United States. Such losses remind us that terrorism is a threat, not just to the United States, but to all nations. In an increasingly interconnected world, both culturally, financially, with instantaneous information, an attack against one is in a very real sense an attack against others. The conflicts over the past decade has affected all of us, while also teaching us some important lessons. Some were new, and some we learned again the hard way. I'd like to share with you today 3 general observations. I'll start with what I think is a defining characteristic of our shared operating environment. In today's increasingly networked world, we have entered into a period of accelerating change, one that carries significant consequences for military and intelligence professionals. Fighter pilots have a saying that when it comes to a dogfight, speed is life. I find that is increasingly true for those of us that serve in the military and in the intelligence professions. We only have to look at the history being made across North Africa and the Middle East today. What began in Tunisia last December has left few countries in the region untouched, or the citizens of those countries unchanged. Like a long dormant geological fault line jolted by an earthquake, history throughout the region is on the move. The so-called Arab Spring has evolved into the hot Arab summer in Yemen, Libya, and Syria. No matter your sources of information, few can predict with confidence the full impact of what we are seeing occur in the Middle East today. We also must be mindful that the 21st century social media tools such as Facebook and Twitter do not necessarily guarantee good outcomes. History is full of examples of revolutions that fail to produce positive change. The experience of the French Revolution led some to observe that revolutions devour their children. But the patterns and cycles that once took years or months in previous revolutions in history, we now see unfolding in weeks, days, and hours. With YouTube providing near real-time coverage of the Jasmine Revolution, the Arab Spring, and Syria's efforts to crush dissent, the revolution indeed is being televised, and we see the challenge it presents for participants and observers alike. Time after time, we have seen the awareness and decision-making by governments in those countries outpaced by highly decentralized and networked citizens. And for other nations on the outside looking in, trying to understand the course of events and implications, it has been a very humbling experience. With citizens over the world over, able to communicate in text and video in real time, the speed of events has compressed the time available for decision making. And intelligence professionals are now expected to collect information and deliver analysis on the events nearly in real time as the crisis is unfolding. Earlier in my career, intelligence professionals wrote reports and delivered them the next day. Today's history is being streamed in real time, and intelligence reports delivered the next day make me a historian. Transnational terrorist groups also have access to the same information technologies, including computers, digital cameras, thumb drives, and publishing and video editing software. Some of those groups have proven themselves to be highly adaptive and resilient learning organizations, and increasingly, they are reacting to events, learning lessons, networking, reorienting, and reconstituting themselves after setbacks more quickly than ever. Highly adaptive, we have seen these groups employ new tactics. We saw the so-called underwear bomber, the plot to destroy airplanes with bombs disguised in printer cartridges. And we see press reports now claiming that terrorists interest in surgically implanting bombs inside people. Under enormous pressure, terrorist groups have learned how to leverage the internet for defensive and offensive purposes. And the technologies they employ accelerate the speed at which they operate, while also magnifying their reach to new supporters such as independent or lone wolf actors prone to self-radicalization and subsequent terrorist acts. We see that in the efforts by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to create an English language magazine to recruit new members and inspire attacks. And the shooting at Fort Hood, Texas reminds us that not even our own ranks are immune to self-radicalized individuals. We have seen the speed at which decentralized, relatively flat networks can operate, react, and adapt. And that is a challenge for institutions built on vertical, top-down decision-making, such as many of the military institutions and government agencies headquartered in the Washington, D.C. region. Fortunately, we have adjusted significantly to this accelerating rate of change, and that takes me to my second observation. In order to be successful against terrorism in today's environment, it is imperative to fuse intelligence and operations to the maximum extent possible. Over the last 10 years, we have pushed a lot of intelligence capability forward in direct support of our military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that includes in support of allies who are or who have been engaged with us in those theaters. Because of the speed of events on the battlefield, DIA has forward deployed more analysts and other professionals to the battlefield than at any time in its nearly 50-year history. And frankly, it has transformed DIA from a garrison agency headquarters in Washington that historically supported small deployments of personnel into a globally deployed agency supported by a headquarters in Washington. In previous conflicts, DIA would conduct much of its work in Washington and push the information forward to the battlefield. By the time the intelligence arrived, sometimes it was useful and timely. Other times, it was not. That old construct had no chance of surviving under the demands of the modern battlefield against insurgencies and terrorists. And so in the years since the 9/11 attacks, DIA has deployed increasing numbers of personnel, and today that number ranges in the area of about 850 personnel or so, give or take, that are there to provide direct support to our military commanders and troops on the ground and provide the best possible advice to policymakers back here in Washington. DIA pays those intelligence professionals. We equip them, we train them, and we support them. But in a day-to-day sense, those DIA professionals work for the military commanders and the troops that they are forward deployed with. In addition, we have found the most success when we place our personnel alongside those of other intelligence agencies and other intelligence disciplines. The effect has been profound. Different intelligence disciplines often tip or cue one another, leading to increased collection and to more detailed and more useful analysis. Moreover, all of that work is much more attuned to the needs of the military commander and the troops on the ground. Our people are participating in commanders' daily briefings. They absorb the commander's needs and work within the staff's battle rhythm, not the rhythm someplace else, like Washington, D.C. The intelligence we provide is no longer a once-a-day morning report. Now it is a constant stream of knowledge and advantage that informs, affects, or even shapes the commander's decision-making in real time. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates put it this way: "There's been a revolution in both intelligence collection and the application of intelligence to operations. The fusion of intelligence and operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just with the special forces, but with the conventional forces, is something that 10 years ago people wouldn't have believed possible." The standard for defense intelligence has shifted considerably in the decades since 9/11. No longer is it acceptable for intelligence to merely support operations. What we are seeing on the battlefield today is that good intelligence drives operations. That is what we aim for, because that is what today's strategic environment requires. Yet no matter how proficient we become, we recognize that success cannot be achieved in isolation. While there will always be a place and a role for unilateral operations, the larger campaign against terrorism requires cooperation among nations, which takes me to my third observation. More than ever, successful operations against terrorism are multinational, not so much by choice, but by necessity. The threat posed by terrorism today transcends national borders. To form an effective response, robust counterterrorism operations require increased cooperation and shared responsibility among international partners. While there will always be limits, we have made great progress in the recent years. Now, I've been an intelligence professional for a long time, and I have to tell you that we are sharing intelligence to a degree and with partners that I never would have thought possible earlier in my career. And that is the key point I want to make with you. When crises arise, that is not the time to start building relationships. There won't be time. Events will be moving too quickly. We have to start well in advance, years and decades. What we are doing today with our allies, building trust, opening up pipelines for information sharing, prepares us for crises or conflicts that we may not even be able to conceive of right now. And that two-way education among nations is important at this point in history. More than ever, the problems and challenges we face today are bigger and more complex than can be solved by any one country or only by one alliance. Many of the challenges we face today confront many nations and require that we all work together. Whether nations are jointly conducting humanitarian assistance operations, counter-piracy maritime patrols, peacekeeping missions, or engaged in counterinsurgency operations, increasingly we need to all find to strengthen the trust that military and intelligence relationships require. The terrorist groups that we face today are highly complex, highly adaptive, and very resilient. Al-Qaeda has taken some very hard hits recently and is currently under a lot of pressure, especially at the most senior levels. That having been said, we are watching today how that pressure transforms the movement, especially within the regional affiliate groups, such as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. We have learned over the last 10 years that no one nation can achieve success alone. We increase our collective odds of success significantly by working together. Regardless of the type of mission, each partner nation brings something unique to the fight, whether that be different skill sets, different access, a novel approach or technique, or perhaps a diversity of language or analytical capability. And that's good against the problem sets that we face, whether it be Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or another terrorist group. Collectively, we need every different kind of tool we can employ to get at these hard problems and hard targets. some of which are very much intertwined with local, tribal, ethnic, or religious conflicts. That level of cooperation is needed today because many of today's terrorist adversaries, international criminal or proliferation networks, or maritime pirates, seek advantage by hiding and operating in the gaps and seams between nations, between alliances, between borders, and in ungoverned areas beyond the central government's control. Defeating these kinds of threats will require greater levels of information sharing and cooperation among nations than we have ever seen before. By working together, we can all close those gaps and seams, and by doing so, increase our collective security. What we have seen and experienced in the decade of war since 9/11 represents a new world for those of us that wear the military uniform and who are called upon to operate in today's evolving environment. DIA has been at war for 10 years. More than 2/3 of our employees today came aboard after the 9/11 attack. They have known nothing except providing wartime intelligence to commanders and policymakers. By virtue of their experience, their hard work, their commitment, they have transformed DIA into a much forward deployed agency that drives military operations like never before. That is why we need the most talented students to consider a career in uniform or as a civilian intelligence professional. We need students today to study foreign languages, to study foreign cultures, to study political science, to study history, all of which Hillsdale is good at. At this very moment, many of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and intelligence professionals are working side by side on the battlefield. They are sharing risk and facing dangers together. They deserve the very best intelligence support that we can give them. We owe it to them to recruit the best minds into our profession, to ask the hard questions, to challenge ourselves, to challenge one another, and our traditional ways of approaching problems. Most of all, they deserve our ability to recognize when old methods of operating no longer apply and when new approaches and solutions are required. Let me close with a few words from the Secretary of Defense. I believe it reflects in a very real way the progress we have made in the fight against transnational terrorism. During a flight to visit our troops in Afghanistan, Secretary of Defense Panetta said that now is the moment. Now is the moment to put maximum pressure on them, because I do believe that if we continue this effort, that we can really cripple Al-Qaeda as a threat. He could make that statement only because of the tremendous amount of work that has been done within this government, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and with our allies and partners around the world. But at the same time, it also signals that what we can achieve in the weeks, months, and years ahead by maintaining a sharp focus on our mission and seeing the job through to the end. We owe that to the families and friends who lost loved ones to 10 years ago, and those that have lost loved ones and friends since that time. We owe that to the men and women that are serving today. We owe that to the citizens of our country. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Sir.
General, as a submarine officer, I'm
Cool.
very sensitive to the problems of giving an unclassified briefing from a classified position. However,
Thank you.
could you make the distinction between the Central Intelligence Agency and the DIA in terms of responsibility and what you do, and perhaps a little more information about the personnel splits of military and civilian and budget of your agency?
Yeah, I'll come to the. I'll take the second part of your question first, and then take the first part. And let me just say up front on the questions, because I say this when I do public speaking, I appreciate your understanding the situation in which I find myself. As I tell people quite often, I've been doing intelligence work for a long time. And so there are times I wonder in my own head about what I know, whether that's classified or whether it's not. That shouldn't impact you. You ought to ask whatever question you want. And it's my job to figure out how to answer the question. And my guarantee to you is I will figure out a way to answer your question, even if you border on one that may get me in trouble. But the Defense Intelligence Agency right now, my agency has authorized about 18,000 personnel inside my agency. And that makeup is split right now between 65% civilian and 35% that wear the uniform of that 18,000. And, you know, as I tell people, without getting into the classified portion on it, right now I have been provided the resources in terms of the dollars and budget to do the mission that I've been given. So we're in pretty good shape. Not going to say I'm not going to fight for more, but at the end of the day, I've got enough resources to do the mission that I've been given. When you look at the Defense Intelligence Agency and compare us to CIA, for example, in this case, first of all, you need to remember that inside the Department of Defense, there are parts of the intelligence community that exist there, such as myself, DIA, NSA, NGA, National Security Agency, National Geospatial Agency, and the National Reconnaissance Office, and myself, that make that up. And as such, I am what is referred to as a combat support agency inside the Department of Defense. And so therefore, my particular responsibility is to provide intelligence to the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the full myriad of commanders running from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs through the combatant commanders, such as the combatant commander for Central Command, which is the region most people normally focus on, there with General Mattis at U.S. Central Command in Tampa, focused on that part of the world, but we have combatant commanders that have responsibility worldwide. And so my responsibility, along with my agency, is to provide intelligence support not only to those folks in uniform, but to also provide support to folks that do policy making in the defense realm, inside the Department of Defense, and others represented inside the interagency process, to include ensuring that I present what I would call a defense view on intelligence. In terms of how we look at the facts, because let me talk about the Central Intelligence Agency for just a second. In terms of their responsibility, they also are responsible for providing intelligence support to the United States in terms of what they do. They also, like the Defense Intelligence Agency, are what we call an all-source analytical agency. And they also execute other operations in terms of what they do on that. But one of the primary things that they do is provide that all-source intelligence. What we mean in the intelligence community when we say all-source for people that don't do intelligence work, there are a lot of intelligence disciplines out there. For example, human intelligence. That's basically doing what some people might refer to as, you know, going out and having a human collector, some want to call a spy, you know, people that do that kind of work. You have folks that just go out and do normal intel reporting from a human perspective in the day-to-day course of their duties. You have signals intelligence. That is that information that we gather by collecting signals, you know, from the air and analyzing those signals, and that's called signals intelligence. You've got imagery intelligence, you know, pictures, things that are taken by things that aren't on the ground, whether that be in the sky or other ways, imagery intelligence. So you've got a lot of different, but only CIA and DIA, along with the State Department with a very small group, so really CIA and DIA do what we call all source analysis. So when one of my analysts publish an article on Afghanistan, like CIA would, they take imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, human intelligence, open source intelligence, OSINT, as we call it, because quite honestly, you can get some reasonably good information sometimes from the press. You have to consider the source, as I say, in some of that, as you take a look at it. But an all-source analyst brings in all the different pipes and analyzes that and comes out with their assessment. Then for policymakers. But both of us do that type of work. My work is primarily focused on supporting military and doing defense, while CIA provides it to a broader group across the United States government and for the nation. And while their specific focus is not defense, they would report on other things such as political and economic and other things that I would not necessarily be in a sweet spot for me. Sir.
General, thank you for coming. My question is maybe, well, I'll just throw it out. From a defense perspective, would you say that the greater threat to our national security and our way of life comes from the Muslim Brotherhood or the nation state of Libya under Muammar Gaddafi?
I'm not going to parse in piece of the way you've asked what I mean. Currently, we're a nation, as I said, in my remarks, that have been under attack. We've been at war for the past 10 years. In fact, the fight actually started before that. You can go back in history, but at least if you go back to 1998, where bin Laden issued his fatwa against the United States, he kind of gave us an indication back in 1998 what was in store for us, and that manifested itself in later on in the attacks. I will say this, reference the question you asked. One of the problems that we have is people will ask, and they'll ask the intelligence community, for example, about the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, you've got to be careful because it means a different thing depending on which country you are talking about, or a region, for example. I'm not going to make light because I know I'm being taped, but it's like saying that all Republicans are the same or all Democrats are the same. You got to be careful because all Muslim Brotherhood are not the same. So there are, certainly folks out there in the different countries that we pay more attention to than others, but we've got to be careful about a generalization, if you would. And so, currently, going to the second part of your question there on Libya, we're following the events there almost on an hour-by-hour basis in terms of doing that. And so at the current time, of course, I don't see Libya presenting a threat to the United States, and I think that goes without saying. But, might they have been before? That's another discussion we could have. Sir.
Thank you. I have more of a philosophical, strategic type question. How much thinking, or is it going on now, or has it happened at all, about what is going to be the definition of victory? And then obviously backward planning from that to determine, if you do X, Y, and Z, you win. Any thoughts on that?
Well, from a military perspective, I don't reside in the policy world any longer, in my current position. But one of the things that people always take a look at on the policy side and on the military side, but as you do what we would call in the military campaign planning, you take a look and you put it in a format of what we would call ways, means, and ends. And the ways are how you go about doing something, the means are what are you going to use to accomplish that, and of course then the ends. What is an end state? What is the end state? Defining an end state is difficult because there are different ways to get at it, and as I jokingly say in public when I speak, and I don't mean it in a trite way, we're a nation separated by a common language, English. And words mean different things to different people, and people want to parse words all the time on that. But an end state is generally articulated, if you will, in a campaign plan, and it is something that over time, I think, moves depending on the situation and the circumstances that play out. But it is something that, from a military perspective, we always go into a campaign or operation attempting to define what the end state will be. And then it's up to our, masters to determine whether they agree with that or not. Sir.
Thank you for your service. Understanding the climate of the day, and we're facing 9/11, do you think that our Defense Intelligence Agency ought to back up and focus on our country? I know we're focusing internationally, but we have wide open borders and north and south. Should we back up and focus on the attackers that at 9/11 were from within?
Yeah. From a DIA perspective, not necessarily. I'll answer your question then, speaking as a representative, as a member of the United States intelligence community. I think, folks learned some very hard lessons, as I referenced in my remarks. Some of the lessons that we learned brought about a change in this nation that manifested itself in the passage of the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, IRPTA for short, as some have called it. And that law brought about a change. Most significant change that was brought about by the law was the establishment of a Director of National Intelligence to oversee this thing we as a nation call the United States intelligence community. And I think there has been a lot of good that has come out of that. But from a defense perspective, my focus generally, and I'm saying that in this audience, generally is from the borders out. Because from the very first days, for y'all, Hillsdale studies, as you go back and take a look, our nation has been protected by not only one, the military doing things inside our own borders, but two, not just military but others, gathering information or intelligence on those inside our borders for good reason. Having said that, we have agencies inside our system that are charged with that type of work. I want to be careful to make sure nobody goes screaming out of here talking about an internal security service like is seen in other countries. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about law enforcement, and so what folks have to do. But there's always a rub. And when I talk to audiences, and I speak to a lot of audiences around college campuses and many other places, that's a fair discussion for a democracy to have. At what point in time does security and requirements to protect the nation, when it starts rubbing up against our civil liberties, where is that line and where should it move to? I'm not taking a stance one way or the other. That's a legitimate discussion for a democracy to have and see where we go. And I think that's one of the things that this school does very well. Ma'am.
Thank you for your service as well. It sounded like you said you felt you had enough resources now, but if you consider the super committee, and if they do not reach agreement, it would trigger across the board cut. It seems to me that you're bombarded with more information on a daily basis and providing resources. How would that automatic trigger across the board in government and a decrease impact your agency's ability to keep this country safe?
Well, I think if the group doesn't come to some sort of agreement and there's a cut made, at the end of the day, I am going to see some cut in resources. Doesn't matter whether the group comes to agreement or not. I think as we look, if I step back, taking my hat off as the director of DIA and just looking at it like everybody else, there have got to be some changes made. And so I'm going to see some reduction in resources. Well, that's the reason I get paid the big bucks. Like every other person in a senior leadership position, I am going to have to assess risk, make sure my bosses understand where I am accepting risk on their behalf, and then me, along with my leadership, will have to manage that risk. And I know I used a lot of terms there to walk me through, but the fact is, at the end of the day, I believe for the mission that I have been given, my assessment as I've looked at it, right now I have enough resources. Depending on how far a cut goes, I might not be saying it quite with such a big smile on my face. But at the end of the day, I will then have to take a look and deal with the resources that I've been given to do the mission and let folks know what I will and won't be able to do. But I think as I've played in the process so far, unless things really go in a different direction than what I have been briefed on, I think I will have reasonable resources to do the mission that I've been given. Sir, I'll go.
General Burgess, as an intelligence all source analyst of about your generation, I'm confused by some information I'm hearing about the new generation of analysts that are working in the military. Such things as pattern of life analysts and social network analysts. I'm wondering from the academic standpoint, could you go a little bit further in telling people who represent Hillsdale and other universities if there are shifts in the way that we should prepare students for these new types of analysis?
I'm not sure I would say that, we ought to be preparing folks any differently. I will tell you that as I step back and take a look now from my days in the Director of National Intelligence and now in the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and look, clearly we need folks. Academia generally calls them in some cases anthropologists. We really do need people that understand cultures as we get into and have been doing the fight that really requires a lot of understanding of tribal distinctions and down at group level, which is not necessarily a skill set that many of us, as mentioned, I'm a 1974 proud graduate of Auburn University, and I was a political science major with a double minor in history, and not sure that helped me a whole lot here as I was getting into some of this a little bit. So whether it be understanding that the baseline cultures and the effects thereof, but also foreign languages. One of the things that we don't do well, one of the things I'm charged to do as an example, is try and take a look, because, we don't grow linguists overnight. It takes a while, and some of these languages and dialects are pretty hard on some of it. And so, to get somebody through the pipeline and all, or to recruit a student, I ought to be predicting what languages I'm going to need. And I tell the story, and I can say this in public. So I tell the story. I'm sitting there, minding my own business as the J2 of U.S. Southern Command, and we stand up Guantanamo Bay, and so I'm required to get folks in that speak different languages, and I'm sitting there and I'm going through the list of the languages we'll need, and all of them are kind of registering, even to a guy from Auburn, what part of the world they're from. As I go through it, War Eagle, sir, thank you. But then I get to this one that I even mispronounced the first time, but it's Uyghur. And it's a dialect out of a central part of Asia there. We don't have many of those inside the Department of Defense. And you're not going to create one by sending somebody to an immersion course in 6 weeks to do the kind of job we're doing. So, I need to be predictive in where I'm going to need somebody so that the pipeline will produce something. So, I've got to help more on this. Let's take another example. The subcontinent of India as an example. 600 plus dialects from that one country. Just to have somebody to engage with. This is tough. This is tough work. So Go for it, academia. Give it your best shot. Sir.
General, I appreciate your time. My question is, the recent downgrade of NASA, what challenges, given the total source of information, what challenges you see over the next 40, 50 years that presents to the intelligence community? Thank you.
Clearly, as they look at some of the things that they're looking at that you've alluded to, is going to have an impact. We're going to have to take a look as an intelligence community for the United States of how we will fill in some of the areas where we might have some concerns in terms of some of that as it goes ahead. Looking at the way ahead, whether it be NASA in terms of doing it or somebody else doing it, there are going to be certain capabilities that we're going to require. And no one in the intelligence community is going to tell you that we're, ecstatic with things like that, because just like a commander, I have yet to run into a policymaker, I've yet to run into a commander on the ground that has ever in my, they keep saying 40, but to be fair, I'm going on 38 years service, but, I'll take every year I can get. But I have yet in my time to ever run into anybody that I'm doing a brief to at any level as I'm doing the intelligence briefing to say, oh, stop, Ron, I've got enough intel. You don't need to give me any more. I've got all the intelligence I need. It's just not the way it works. So it'll have an impact. We as the system will have to figure out how to mitigate that. Sir.
By the way, I fit nicely into your briefing because I was a career fighter pilot. I was also a defense collector as a DAC.
Can you brief doing this?
Yes, sir. I can shoot my watch down.
There you go.
And now I work for one of those other three-letter agencies. My perspective is a tactical and strategic one. From the tactical level, a lot of the work that I see, the work that I do, with the nation-building part of it that's relevant to the intelligence communities that we're working with, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq. The tactical level of success is working very, very well. When we're working across the tables with others that are thirsty for who we are and what we do, we find great success. From a strategic sense, though, my vision is that working this thing from the top down through Maliki and through Karzai is, well, maybe it helps us understand this definition of victory. Could you comment on that?
Sir, what I would say, first of all, I agree with your premise in terms of at the tactical level. At the pointy end of the spear, as I call it, things are working very well, both inside our own U.S. interagency piece, which has not always, to be fair, been our history on this, but I think things are working very, very well down at that level right now. And I think with our friends around the world at that level, it's working well. At the strategic level, as you've talked about, I would not disagree that there are challenges that are out there. As I talk to our military commanders and our interlocutors inside the department, I think, we have an engagement strategy with them. We are working that. I tend to remind audiences, from time to time, again, remember, I don't have a Hillsdale education. I've got an Auburn education. And so I still remember one of the first basic premises that I had in Political Science 201 that applies across the board when we're talking about this, and that is a nation state will always act in what it deems its own national interest. That's pretty much been a given principle throughout time in terms of that. And so we, I think, need to ensure that as we have this discussion, whoever it may be around the world and at whatever level, that we have to keep in mind of how to ensure that while we represent our side, at the end of the day, there are always at least, one other input, and generally speaking, 2 or 3 or 4, especially in the coalition world that we live today. And that's just going to be the way things work. Sir.
One question, sir. Would you estimate the total number of Al-Qaeda operatives in the world are affiliates, are supporters, and just characterize that versus the number of people we have opposing them.
Yeah. Here's what I will do. No, I won't give a number, and here's the reason why. I learned a hard lesson, and I do tell this story in public, and I'll give you an idea so y'all can sit there and take your pot shot at the intel guys. I was one of the jobs that I had in my past. I was the J2 on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so I served as the primary intelligence advisor to the chairman and to the secretary on the Joint Chiefs. And so, you know, I came into that job in 2003, and I still remember dutifully, you know, doing my intelligence briefing, you know, to not only them but to the Hill. And so you got to give testimony. And so I was asked in Iraq, you know, how many folks are we fighting in there? So in 2003, sir, we're out there and it's about 12 to 18,000. 2004, sir, about 12 to 18,000. 2005, I left the job in 2005. Sir, about 12 to 18,000. Now, you can do the math, figure out how many had we killed, how many were incarcerated, and yet I'm still briefing 12 to 18,000. I'm very careful with my analysts, and it has nothing to do about not wanting to get into classified numbers. I don't put a lot of stock in finite numbers in terms of that because, you know, I'm not even sure I have a good assessment in terms of one that I would bet my stars on. We've got numbers we roll around, but when I do the briefing to one of my bosses, I'm real careful about the fidelity of that information and what I put behind it. So I think the numbers, if you look at Al-Qaeda pure and what we would call pure Al-Qaeda and what I might define, and here's where we get into, we're separated by a common language, what you may mean and what I may mean by an operative per se, you know, the number is not as great as some people would believe it is in terms of operatives. When you add in the affiliate groups, AQAP, AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, primarily located in there in the north part of Africa, and then some other affiliated type organizations, wannabes, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and others. The number does move up, but depending on our definition of operative, we would probably be in a different place. But bottom line is Al-Qaeda and its affiliates still are a threat, and I think an important threat to this country that we need to deal with.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I was going to say you got 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, General Burgess. We much appreciate your time and your service and for all of those good insights. In a distinguished Army career of more than 40 years, General Burgess has established a record of exemplary service to his country for which we should all be grateful. General Burgess and his wife, Marta, who I'm pleased to say is here with us today, are the proud parents of 5 children, 2 of whom we at Hillsdale are proud to say are graduates of the college. The academic year has just started, and it's a bracing thought to realize that the college freshmen who just showed up at Hillsdale and around the country were just 8 years old when our nation was attacked on September 11th, 2001. Too young to understand its full meaning, and yet too old to be oblivious to it, those young people have been impacted by the terrorist acts of 9/11 indelibly, as we all have been. More than 1,300 children were orphaned on that day, a day in which nearly 3,000 lives were taken. Let us pause now for a moment of silence in remembrance of those victims. Thank you. Hillsdale College junior Caroline Forsyth, a politics major, is interning this semester with the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is as part of her participation in the semester-long Washington Hillsdale internship program, which brings Hillsdale College undergraduates to Washington for study and work here in the nation's capital. It's a program that is nearly 40 years old. And I'm pleased to say that in keeping with Hillsdale's tradition that students introduce our speakers, I will now call upon Caroline to introduce General Burgess. Caroline.
Welcome. Lieutenant General Ronald Burgess Jr. is the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and Commander of the Joint Functional Component Command. In a career spanning nearly 40 years, he has received numerous awards and decorations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, the Army Achievement Medal, and the NATO Medal. Commissioned in military intelligence through the Auburn University ROTC program, he earned a Master of Science degree in education from the University of Southern California and a Master of Military Arts and Science from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Today, General Burgess will be speaking on the timely and pressing topic, America's War on Terror. Please join me in welcoming General Burgess.
Thanks for the very good intro.
My name is David Bobb, and I serve as director of the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship at Hillsdale College. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to this lecture, part of the First Principles on First Fridays lecture series. This is a monthly series that addresses topics of significant and timely historical, political, and economic subjects. We are grateful today that this lecture series, which bears the name the Mrs. Walter R. Berger First Principles on First Fridays lecture, has been brought about as a result of her generosity. Mrs. Berger lives in Michigan, and she has a number of grandchildren that have served in the United States military, including Earl Pettis, a 2008 alumnus of Hillsdale College, who has recently returned from duty in Afghanistan. Today, we are honored to have as our speaker General Ronald Burgess, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Well done. It is a great honor for me to be here today and spend time with you. I have some prepared remarks that I will move through, and then I have been told that we will do question and answer, and I will handle that here from the podium during that time. But as I prepared for my visit here today, as was pointed out by David, I couldn't help but remember Hillsdale's motto, pursuing truth and defending liberty. And that's a fitting place for me to begin my remarks, because those words reflect the mission of the men and women of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Our intelligence work is aimed at preventing strategic surprise by uncovering the truth about current and potential adversaries' military intentions and capabilities. And we do this in defense of the nation. Just a few hours ago, I presided over DI